I really want to acknowledge all of the, the people at Starts who've had a big role in everything that I've learned, all of my colleagues who've shared with me their expertise and often their lived experience as well. It's been so invaluable to me. So I just want to really thank everyone. Um, so yeah, my name is Joshua, and I'm a psychologist at Starts working as a counsellor, and today I'm going to be presenting the case of Kabir. So all of the personal details, the name, age, country of origin have been changed to maintain confidentiality. And really, I wanted to present this case for a few reasons, which are there on the screen, but in particular, because this highlights the impact of the indefinite detention and the deterrence policy applied to people who arrived in Australia by boat seeking protection. So some background information, Kabir was an asylum seeker from a Southern Asian country. He was referred by the health team at Asylum Seeker Centre in Newtown, who were giving him really comprehensive support. He was currently on a bridging visa, still waiting for the outcome of his protection application. So nearly 6 years later, we're still waiting. And he'd been classified as an illegal maritime arrival. So we'll cover a bit more about what that meant for him later. He had no family in Australia. His wife was overseas in his home country, and she had some really serious medical issues. He was a Muslim man, and this was a really important protective factor for him, and one of his, to be honest, one of his only coping resources. And it was something that really shaped the sessions that we had. He was living with some other men from the same country as him with different but similar visa situations, and he'd been unable to work for a while. So he'd been rejected the government support that is available for this group of people, and so he was completely dependent on the support of the Asylum Seeker Centre. So please bear with me with the amount of text I have on the screen here. I just really wanted to give you detail about my first meeting with Kabir. He arrived about 15 minutes early, and I was called by the receptionist to come. She said, your client's in the waiting room, they don't seem well, can you please come and speak with them? So, when I came out, he, average height and build, Southern Asian man, he was in casual clothing, and he was sitting very rigid in his chair, eyes closed, his head was shaking, he was engaging in different behaviors which seemed involuntary, slapping his chair and clenching his fists, slowly unclenching and clenching and tracing along the palm of his hand. And when I went to greet him, greeted him by name, he was very responsive and, opened his eyes, started talking to me. So we, went into the room and started the session. Those behaviors did continue. And when I did ask him about them, he became quite ashamed, and he said he was confused about what I was asking him about. His affect was very restricted, and he would dissociate a lot during, especially the first 2 sessions, slumping, losing orientation to himself. But when I was able to bring him back to the present, bring him back to himself, through some, supporting his grounding, he showed a lot of insight. He really understood the purpose of counseling. He had really clear reasons why he'd come, and he was very clear in explaining those to me. Which, after seeing his initial presentation, I was actually a bit surprised at the insight that he showed. And it really struck me straight away that I was, talking to someone with a lot of intelligence and who'd really reflected on what they'd experienced. So in terms of the presenting problems, there was a whole range of intrusive symptoms, both nightmares and flashbacks, where, he really would dissociate and feel as if the event was happening again. He said he had real difficulty sleeping. So he described being in bed most of the day, but only ever really been able to sleep for an hour at a time because of the intrusions and some other things that he was experiencing as well. He also reported hearing voices. And what was interesting to me was that this wasn't only in the context of a flashback or when he was dissociating. He said he would hear his mother crying and this sound of water lapping against a boat quite frequently. Again, the behaviors I already mentioned in detail, and what I've called here a conditional suicide plan. So he was very clear with me that he thought about ending his life quite often. He said that as long as his wife was okay and alive, he wouldn't end his life. He assured me he didn't want to end his life, but he was very clear in saying that if his wife did pass away before he was able to reunite with her, he would end his life immediately. So this was quite confronting for me, and making a safety plan around that was definitely a challenge. There was also a lot of negative beliefs that Kabir would express about a whole range of different things, particularly other people, but also himself. He had a very negative self-concept, lots of shame and guilt. He also expressed beliefs that most people who appeared to be caring, even myself, healthcare workers, actually wanted him to suffer. He'd say things like, once I'm dead, then the government will come and put the visa on my dead body. No one really wants to help me. An example of this, one time one of his support payments was a little bit late, and he actually had a session with me the next day. And when he came in, he said, he was crying, and he said, why does the Asylum Seeker Center hate me? Why have they cut off my payments? I knew this was going to happen. I knew they didn't actually care for me. And, it was a quick phone call and able to ascertain that there'd just been a delay in the payment for that week. But he really had this reaction that it was because he wasn't loved, he wasn't cared for. And I think that really highlights the beliefs he had about a lot of other people in his life. So to go through the history, which, as Zach mentioned, sometimes when we're actually able to slow down and hear the history that these symptoms present in, they start to become a lot more understandable. And that was definitely the case for me in my work with Kabir. He described a lot of developmental trauma, a really difficult upbringing. He didn't go into a lot of detail. He would become quite upset when he talked about this, but he talked about being beaten and humiliated by older male cousins, family members. And his father was really his only protector, someone who would look out for him and someone who would put a stop to those other things when they were happening. In terms of refugee trauma, he was a member of quite a marginalized social group, and he was denied a lot of opportunities. And because of that, he actually left his country of origin quite young. At first, took on lots of debt to go and work in another more developed nation. And after 2 years of being exploited, came back to his family with nothing. He then traveled to Australia by boat, and this boat journey was extremely traumatic. He had a lot of difficulty describing the details of this and would begin to dissociate quite rapidly when he was discussing this or when this came up. And he's a case that really highlights where the migration trauma and the post-migration trauma can sometimes be what seems to be the most severe trauma. And so going to the post-migration trauma, he was initially, it seemed, as stable as anyone could be in that sort of situation. When he came to Australia, he was able to work and send money overseas. He was often worried about his wife, who he had to send money for emergency treatment quite often. But again, his capacity to work meant he was able to help out in that way. But then in 2017, he actually had a very traumatic event where he witnessed his father dying from a heart attack. They were on a video call. It was in the middle of the conversation. He witnessed the whole event. He could hear his mother screaming, his wife screaming, but he couldn't do anything to intervene, anything to provide any support. And this was, as you can imagine, very, very traumatic, but also the grief then over that death of his father became very complicated and very traumatic as well. At the time of, I guess, the referral, he'd not been able to earn any money for quite some time. He was in court proceedings related to a workplace injury and workers' compensation, and he was still waiting for his protection visa interview, as I said, more than 5-6 years after he'd arrived in Australia. So this is a model that we use at STARTS. We call it the complex interaction model, developed by Orochi and Coelho. And I won't go through all the different aspects, but it's just to really highlight the range of things that were impacting Kabir's presentation. It wasn't only the trauma reactions themselves. The recovery environment clearly had a big role, the lack of access to support and services here. Kabir, as always, every client I think that we work with at STARTS, there's always protective factors. And I'm a big believer that if you don't see the protective factors, it's because you haven't assessed for them yet. You haven't gotten to know the client well enough yet. And as I mentioned, Kabir's faith was a huge protective factor. His father was a very devout man who passed on a lot of things to him, which I think helped him to cope with what he was experiencing. And later, when he was able to start mourning and start the grieving process to do with his father, he shared some really powerful things. There was ongoing stress as well. If you look at that purple arrow there coming from overseas, where his wife was unwell, the family there who were giving her a place to live were threatening to kick her out if he didn't send money, because he'd recently been able to stop. He recently hadn't been able to send them money. So me and Zachary hadn't actually collaborated on this, but I'd also included a shot here from that recent article, and just really to highlight that the psychotic features often have trauma-related themes, and I think it really highlights that the content of the psychotic features is very often significant. It's not something that doesn't matter. It is something that's often very significant to our clients, and giving them a space to talk about those things, talk about that significance is very important. This is a longer quote from that article, and I think it's really helpful to highlight this today. Kabir actually, there was a service he presented to, and again, I wasn't there. I think, based on what they were presented with, they probably were very concerned, but they called an ambulance and he was hospitalized. It was a very traumatic experience for him. I actually called him when I heard he'd been taken to the hospital, and he told me he was in the jail. And I was initially confused. I thought maybe he'd been taken by the police, not the ambulance. And it took a little while for me to figure out that he was using the word jail to refer to his experience of being in hospital. Again, because of the, I guess, severity of his presentation, the rush to get him to hospital, an interpreter hadn't been called. He hadn't really been assessed and spoken to, asked about what he was experiencing. And without an interpreter, it would have been very hard to understand what he was experiencing. He'd had MRIs and lots of neurological assessment, which had ruled out any sort of neurological or biological cause to his symptoms. And I think this really highlights this distinction between a loss of touch with reality, which is often how psychotic symptoms are understood, compared to what a lot of our clients experience, which is a reality characterized by trauma, pain, insecurity, a lack of safety, and uncertainty about the future. And when it comes to the people who arrived in Australia by boat, that insecurity and uncertainty is prolonged by the current policies around indefinite immigration detention and the processing policies. So I won't go too much into the diagnostic formulation. Zachary's already mentioned some of these important things, but I wanted to highlight the role of not only the developmental trauma in Kabir's presentation, how that early trauma likely shaped the later reactions to trauma, but also the role of grief. Given the traumatic nature of that grief, I think it was quite difficult for him to begin a mourning process, because any thoughts about his father would then trigger quite intense post-traumatic stress symptoms and dissociation. Made it very difficult for him to really reflect on their relationship and do the necessary tasks of mourning and grieving. So treatment goals, in my mind, it was very clear initially to do some suicide prevention, come up with a safety plan around what he'd shared with me. And then following that triphasic or phase-based approach, so really starting with establishing that internal safety and stabilization before shifting to trauma reprocessing and grief and mourning. And then, I guess the third phase would have been moving to rebuilding a life worth living in and rediscovering that connection and meaning. In Kabir's mind, I think it was more straightforward. Initially, practical needs, advocacy for support. But as the sessions went on, I think he really wanted that space to be listened to and to have his experiences witnessed. So in terms of establishing the safety and stabilization, initially there was a lot of case management from my end, writing reports, trying to get him access to services. And I remember sitting with Kabir, and after the third time a certain support had been rejected, saying to him, I think I'm starting to catch up now to how trapped you felt. You've been doing all of these things that I've been trying to do already. And I'm really starting to, catch up to where you're feeling in terms of accessing services. And there was initially a lot of psychoeducation to reduce the fear and the shame he felt with his symptoms, to help him understand that what he was experiencing, although unpleasant and difficult, was an understandable human response to everything that he'd experienced. And, you know, mentioning those behaviors that seemed involuntary, we were actually able to bring away some of that shame and recognize them as the body's attempts to soothe itself, and really build them in as self-soothing and grounding behaviors, things that he could really use to bring himself back into the present. And he explained that tracing along his hand was actually him going through verses from the Quran, and something that he found really helpful. You know, we talk about challenging negative beliefs. It's something that's, you know, we as Zachary was outlining, when it comes to these symptoms, there are things that can be challenged. The old view that, you know, delusional belief can't be challenged, some of these negative beliefs can't be challenged, is really not the case. And the most powerful, I think, type of learning is experiential learning. And the therapeutic relationship, I think, was really critical in challenging some of these beliefs Kabir had about himself and others. And I want to highlight the role of the interpreter, because we had a regular interpreter who was very empathetic, really understood the experiences that Kabir was going through, had worked with other people from similar backgrounds, and just really cared. And I think with the three of us together in those sessions, it created a really safe relational space where Kabir was able to, again, feel safe and then share his experiences. And I think through sharing those experiences more, he got even more confidence in his own strengths. So quite informally, allowing Kabir to lead the depth and direction, he began to process the grief and the trauma of his father's loss. There were several narrations of his father's death that he witnessed, each increasing in detail as he dissociated less. I think there was some, you know, reappraisal about that event, but there was still a lot of shame about his powerlessness and about his separation from his family. So in terms of outcomes, Kabir's presentation had really stabilized. As I said, he started to share some really powerful things and sayings, almost proverbs, reflections on what was important in life and what was giving him purpose and meaning. There was honestly some sessions where I came out and me and the interpreter looked at each other, and it was almost, was that therapy for us or was it for him? The things he shared were very powerful. I put some question marks there over the changes in negative beliefs because, you know, who knows if they will have generalized to other relationships, you know, other relational spaces in terms of his capacity to trust others. And at the time of discharge, there was still a lot of complex difficulties. He was discharged to another counsellor at Starts, and, you know, I think a lot of those difficulties would have persisted as long as he was still experiencing, you know, not knowing what his visa outcome was going to be, and then even then being on temporary visa, which would have meant prolonged separation from his wife and his family. So thanks so much, everyone. And yeah, I look forward to looking at some of the questions. I've seen the chat and the Q&A going off. So but yeah, thanks so much for your time.